In the last little section here, we get into the very briefest discussion of ethics. Now, you can take entire courses on ethics, so this is just meant to be a sort of reminder of this is something that exists. Here are some basics and some maybe important resources to look at if this is something you're interested in. But I always acknowledge that this is a very, very shortened version of a discussion of ethics, and it's just meant for awareness rather than a full education. But with psychology, there are probably a couple of the famous classic psychology studies that you may have heard of before. And a lot of the ones that are very famous are usually that famous because of some kind of notoriety. So maybe you've heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study, or the Milgram obedience studies, or the Stanford prison experiment, or the Little Albert experiment, the Bobo the doll experiment, or even Robbers Cave. These are all very classic psych studies. I mention them in either 104 or 105, sometimes both, but each of these has some aspect that was unethical. Though most of these occurred far back enough, hence them being classic studies, that they existed before we had strict rules that guide our ethics. So in a lot of these cases at the time, they weren't necessarily against the rules. However, they caused enough problems or led to enough harm that people came together and actually made rules and regulations and guidelines for the ethical consideration of individuals participating in research. So we're going to actually look a little bit at those rules. But I suppose first, if we're talking about ethics, what do we actually mean by the term ethics? Ethics is referring to a set of general principles about how people should be educated and treated and respected when they participate in some kind of scientific study. And this is a very science-shifted definition of ethics, but it makes sense for the course. One of our important sort of starting points is the Belmont Report. And this was a sort of a grouping, a conference that was held at the request of US Congress after there was a large outcry against a bunch of those unethical classical experiments. So people were looking at the harm caused to some of the participants, and they said, we need to do something about this. We need to make a list of regulations. So they met for the Belmont Report. And this wasn't just scientists. This was scientists and physicians and ethicists, people who study ethics, philosophers, and even general citizens. And they all met in 1976. The year doesn't really matter, but it helps with timelines for those who like them. But they did a whole critical evaluation of all of these ethical principles and what they thought that researchers should be following when they worked with human participants. So this came out of all of those unethical practices from previous years and that sort of tipped them over the edge. And they proposed three main considerations. So we have our respect for persons, the principle of beneficence, and our principle of justice. And I actually broke these down to get their own slides. But for our respect for persons, we're just saying that people should be treated as autonomous agents, individuals with free will, and they should be free to make their own decisions. And they should be able to make educated decisions. So this is where the concept of informed consent comes in. So we need to give them information about the potential risks and the potential benefits of the research. So what is it that could happen, and is it good or bad for this individual? Also, is it good or bad for maybe the community that they're part of? This is really important. And it needs to be presented in a way where they are not being coerced into participating. And we also have to acknowledge that some groups don't have as much autonomy as others, so they might need special protections. So children, individuals with developmental disabilities, and even prisoners, for different reasons, may not be able to give informed consent. So for our first two groups, we would need the consent, the informed consent of a parent or guardian. For prisoners, we have to worry about the fact that while you're in, say, a controlled environment and where there is a clear hierarchy, if you have a prisoner and a guard tells them that they have a chance to participate in a study, the prisoner may agree to participate, not because they want to, but because they're worried about any pushback. Maybe the guards will treat them poorly for saying no, or something like that. So we need to take extra steps to ensure them that there is no penalty for not participating, so that they don't feel coerced into the act. So that's our first principle. Our second principle is that of beneficence. And this says that our researchers have to take precautions to protect our participants from harm as much as possible and to ensure their well-being. So we, as researchers, need to consider potential risks. Have they given us any information that might get out and, say, connect them to this study? And if so, how do we assure them that it's protected? So we can do an anonymous study or a confidential study. Anonymous meaning that none of the information is linked, or none of their information is actually collected. So this would be a survey where they get your opinion, but they never collect your name or contact info. A confidential study would be that they take your information, but it's protected from access from anyone else. The research participation goes more with the confidential aspect because they need to collect information in order to give you participation points. However, they separate your name from your data through some randomly generated number in the middle. So the number is only ever associated with the data. Your name never gets directly associated. So we take steps to protect identity. We also have to consider potential benefits. So that kind of ties into our informed consent, but we want to make sure that the participants know that the outcome of this result might be useful for you or for those in your community or for humans in general. And we also want to make sure that people are aware of both of these, and it should be explained in very clear ways. And the last principle is that of justice. And so here we are looking at making sure that those risks and benefits get equally distributed between all the groups that could potentially benefit. So in some of those early unethical practices, so for example, if you looked at the Tuskegee syphilis study, this is when the researchers ended up primarily targeting very low income, mainly Black neighborhoods. And they had individuals in those communities participate in a study where they thought that they were receiving treatment for syphilis. But in fact, they were just being observed to watch how the disease progressed. However, when they finally started learning about syphilis and eventually cured it, though there's a whole bunch of weirdness that goes on in the background of how awful that study was, the benefits weren't necessarily applied to the group that had taken all the risks. So other people were receiving treatment for syphilis, but a lot of those in the study itself weren't treated until years and years after the treatment was discovered and sort of perfected. So there's a whole lot of situations where that was a very unjust scenario. And so nowadays, you have to have people in all the groups that could benefit should all also be taking on some of those risks. So no one group shoulders all the risks and no one group reaps all the benefits. It should all be equally distributed. Now, the 1970s was quite a while back, but there have been updates since. So one of the most recent large overhauls was the APA Ethical Principles update that happened in 2002, and there have been small revisions ever since. But mainly what they did was they took that principle of beneficence and they split it up into now 3 subcomponents. So that you still want to be treating people in the ways that benefit them and try and reduce suffering. But this also says that we have trying to think of the right word here. As a researcher, you have certain ways that you should be behaving. So you have to conduct good research. You have to have good conduct. You have to be accurate and truthful and honest in the role that you take on. So these are a lot about what the researcher should do in their own way, not just for how they would interact with their participants. So very, very similar, just split up a little bit more in case you're interested. And then the last little bit here is where we can look at what are some of these sort of considerations nowadays. So this is from the American Psychological Association. They actually have 10 specific ethical standards, and of those, standard 8 is the most specific to psychologists as researchers. So we have to have these institutional review boards. That's a neutral third party who's going to be looking at our proposals for research to ensure that we're not violating any of these ethical considerations. We need informed consent. We need to know that if we need to deceive our participants, if we can't give them all the information when we get informed consent, if we have to lie or sort of not tell the whole truth, then we need some neutral third party's approval that withholding that information doesn't have the potential to cause harm. Or if it does cause harm, that it is mitigated or overcome by the potential benefit. Usually that leads to us sort of warning them of the potential for harm, but without telling them specifics of the source of it. And anytime there's any kind of deception, you need to follow up with a debriefing where you tell them what information was withheld and why, and anything relevant after the fact. In practice, you will almost always see a debriefing anyways, just because it helps you check in and make sure that no one is sort of negatively affected by the research after the fact. We then have rules for what happens if you violate ethics, what happens if you fabricate data, what happens if you plagiarize. And there are all different massively impactful things that basically ruin a researcher's career, saying that it doesn't seem like a huge deal on paper, but in reality, if you don't follow ethical rules, you don't have a career as a scientist. And because this is something that is a sort of North America wide and every other country has some version of this, you're going to end up not being able to do research anywhere. And then they also have a small section that covers animal research. So anything that is non-human research, that gets its own cover as well. And just very, very quickly, they have those legal protections for non-human animals. They focus, because you can't do things like informed consent, so they focus on replacement, refinement, and reduction, the 3 R's. So replacement, could you use something other than the species you've proposed? So instead of using monkeys, could you use rats? Or could you use an artificial neural network and not need animals at all? Can you refine the study itself? Can you reduce the amount of harm that's being caused? Can you make it more effective or less fear-causing or whatever? Can you make the study any better so that it's not causing distress? And then reduction, could you use fewer animals? And this usually involves doing a power calculation and using the smallest sample size that you can while still having a reasonable power for your study. So we have this sort of ethical balance between the welfare of the animals, their rights, as well as the potential benefits that could come out from that research. And of course, all of this, just like with our human ethics, is fed through that neutral third party that makes those decisions by reviewing research before it ever starts. So these review boards are going to control both human and non-human animal research. And so our conclusion for the ethics section here, we're basically saying that we're trying to balance our priorities. We acknowledge that there can be some situations where information may need to be withheld. So we follow up with explaining why it was withheld and sort of any other follow-ups necessary. For the acknowledgement that, yes, there might be the need for something that is uncomfortable or distressing or even painful, but the benefits that could come from that research are going to outweigh those negatives to begin with. And all of these balances, these aren't determined by the researchers. Once again, these are determined by those review boards. So we have a neutral party doing this weighting of pros and cons to make sure that we're never causing more harm than we are sort of having that potential for benefit in the future. So yeah, we weigh the potential for harm with the potential for knowledge that we can gain and the contributions to science as a whole in the future.